Good morning, good evening, everyone. Thanks very much for finding time to join today. I'm just delighted to introduce my colleague, Nick Reed, who has been leading our audiology initiative and collecting very cool hearing data from India, but also in the US and many different parts of the world. So without an overview, I'd like to have Nick all the time he wants to learn about our audiology initiative. Thanks
Yeah.
again, Nick. Take it away.
Thanks for having me. Let me share my screen here. Um, all right. Thank you so much for letting me join this morning. Broadly, I do epidemiologic initiatives for hearing data. I think in like 14 different studies around the world now. We've done everything from the National Health Aging Trends to LASI-DAD, like this study, to the Lebanese study of aging. As well as like big clinical study trials and studies like the atherosclerosis risk in communities and the Achieve hearing aid clinical trial. And I was putting together my slides this morning, and I kind of thought what would be interesting is also to give a deeper background knowledge on why do we even study this area, because I think it's still something that people hear a lot about, but really don't have a strong grasp of. And then I'll share two of the three in progress projects that we have, and I think now are really nearing completion on the LASI data, and tell you a little bit more about our measure as well. Probably easier to just do questions at the end, but if there's anything burning, I guess feel free to put it in the chat and maybe Sarah can interrupt me or something. Hearing loss and cognition has become sort of a hot topic area. And whenever I start with this, I actually usually like to just, give people the big picture view on public health and hearing loss. If we just look at the prevalence of hearing loss, this is data in the United States weighted to the census that our team produced a few years ago. Once you get over the age of 70 in the US, two-thirds of adults have hearing loss. Now, I have to admit this is slightly confusing. In the past few years, the World Health Organization updated their criteria and the categories and cut points for hearing loss. And so they actually made it less restrictive. And so now we went from, in this figure, two-thirds over 70 having hearing loss to something like around 88% or 90% having hearing loss with the new criteria. That is super confusing and super annoying that something like that happened, that suddenly, overnight everybody has hearing loss who's older. So, it does make it hard to compare ecologically right now in these moments, but I will always sort of give you both numbers. But I think the main takeaway is that as we age, a lot of us have hearing loss, and it's probably more than we expected. The vast majority is more of a mild hearing loss as well. And mild hearing loss isn't always noticeable. It's much more of a clarity than a volume issue. And for our team and where we approach this from, the brain is important, but the only way the brain interacts with the world is via senses, right? Your sensory input is the only thing that gives the brain anything to make sense of. So you hear sounds and language and words, and then your brain adds meaning to those. And it's how you're social, it's how you engage, it's how you're physical, right? So we need sensory input for brain health. We think it's fundamental to it. And specifically, when I think about hearing and hearing loss, when you have hearing loss, most of us sort of conceptually think of it as just everything getting softer. But the truth is, it's more like, an encoding and decoding issue and listening to maybe like a bad radio signal. If you've ever been in the car, and, for those of us who are older and listen to the radio, and you're driving away from a signal and it starts to get scratchy and difficult, or if you have a bad cell phone signal, a sentence like you should go to the pharmacy before you get to your house is going to sound more like you would go to arm E before you get to your oo. It's kind of garbled and gibberish and hard to understand, but it's not necessarily soft. And so this adds effortful listening to your brain. And if you've listened to that bad radio signal or you've been on a bad cell phone signal call, you know that you get tired just from trying to keep up with the signal over time. And that can create sort of this fatigue that could lead to ways that, hearing itself causes cognitive decline over time. But what's key when we think about this sort of area is that the measures you use matter, right? There are many different ways to measure hearing, or broadly hearing and listening. There are things that are truly sort of objective, like an auditory brainstem response, which is an electrophysiologic response. Pure tone audiometry is that idea of pressing a button when you hear a signal. Uh, Words in quiet or central auditory measures are when you're playing sentences to people in the sound booth or in the clinic, and they repeat those words back to you, or how you report your hearing. But the thing that's important is that as we move up this ladder, the brain itself, your cognition itself, is much more central to the measure. And so that means that if you use self-report measures of hearing in a study, you're relying someone on someone's cognition because in how they're going to report that measure. Whereas pure tone audiometry, this idea of pressing a button and just recognizing sound, it's very automatic. It's very much something that we can kind of do without cognitive input. I'll say that, in my clinic, even though I study older adults and dementia, believe it or not, clinically, I am a pediatric audiologist. I got into the dementia space because the same methods that we use to test kids were methods that were thought to be something we would use to test older adults with dementia, using sort of visual reinforcement or closed set loops. But it really turns out that you can get basically a standard audiogram, standard testing on adults with dementia repeatedly. And there's some good evidence for that more recently. So this area in hearing loss and aging in public health, it's kind of exploded recently, but it's not totally new. Way back in 1989, way back, it really shouldn't be that long ago, but it is now quite a while. Um, a paper came out in JAMA, and they basically did a case control analysis of adults with dementia, and they just showed that the prevalence of hearing loss was significantly higher in adults with dementia versus those without, in a really simple analysis. It was in JAMA, it was well received. And then we really didn't hear much about age-related hearing loss and cognitive health or any big public health issues for older adults for, almost 20 years or so. And then Frank Lin, my longtime mentor, released one of his first papers on hearing loss and incident dementia, and then a follow-up, several studies on cognition and hearing loss. And one that I like to highlight from that is data from Health ABC. This is a study of 2,000 older adults in Pittsburgh and Memphis in the United States, over 70 years of age, and this is over a 6-year period. And if you look at baseline cognitive scores by hearing status, normal hearing being the dark circles, open hearing loss being the open circles, we can visually see the slopes are different, right? What I like about this study is they used the mini mental, which had a 41% faster rate of cognitive decline. They also used the digit symbol substitution test, which had a 32% faster rate of cognitive decline. This study gave us a lot of insight actually into the field because the first thing people said was, well, if you have hearing loss, you just can't hear the test, which means that it's just a function of access to test materials. But the digit symbol substitution test can be done without auditory input. So we give all the instructions and we do the test, and you can actually see in these two estimates sort of that additional auditory effect where the 3MS cannot be done without auditory input. You have to orally communicate throughout the test. And so it adds a little bit faster rate of cognitive decline, but it's not totally gone when we remove that auditory input. Another large study that came out in this space that I think has informed a lot of thinking was Jennifer Deal, building off of Frank's work. Frank is on this paper as well in the ERIC study, and this is actually around the time I joined their lab. Uh, and they looked at incident dementia in Health ABC over 9 years by hearing status. And what they found is that moderate or greater hearing loss was associated with 55% higher risk or hazard ratio of developing dementia. And then there was a significant trend as well as a significant effect on the continuous measure of hearing. So what we call pure tone average, that I'll tell you about more. Every 10 decibel increase, which is like moving from mild, to moderate severe to severe, added a 14% increased risk. things have exploded since this period. If you just look at PubMed and you search age-related hearing loss, aging, and you exclude the auditory journals, we've still had like a 400% increase in the past 15 years in literature published sort of in the more mainstream medical journals in this space. It really is something that's an interesting phenomenon, partly driven by media too. And I think it culminated in this figure that many people have seen, but I'm not sure we all fully really grasp sometimes. And so, you know, I like to take a second and think about this. What this figure's telling us is that, and this is actually the 2020, there's a more updated one, but relatively same concept. 60% of dementia risk is unknown. It's genetic, it's something, we don't know the risk fully, and 40% we believe is modifiable based off of large meta-analyses. Those include risks like education, hearing loss, traumatic brain injury, smoking, social isolation. If you interpret the 8% for hearing loss, it means if you eliminate all hearing loss in the world, you eliminate 8% of dementia. I think that that's important because, yes, it's a large modifiable risk factor on the global scale. But remember that this idea of attributable risk fractions takes into account prevalence. And so if it's 8% and almost every adult over 80 has hearing loss, you're talking about something that at a meaningful individual scale is relatively little, right? Because we're spreading this risk across a lot of people in prevalence, whereas fewer older adults smoke, fewer have traumatic brain injury, fewer have depression, right? Those are very high prevalence, but not as high as hearing loss. Hearing loss, we're literally talking like an over 80% and 90% over 80 years of age, right? So we're talking about really large numbers here. So I think it's important that we sometimes think that it doesn't necessarily mean treating hearing is more important at an individual level than treating smoking or depression or social isolation, which sort of gets mixed up in the messaging, I think. It's very much a population phenomenon. And the truth is, the population matters, and we know very little outside of Europe and the United States. China has started to produce some studies with more traditional measures of hearing or higher quality measures of hearing and cognition, but very few in Latin America, very few in India. The Lancet group did do an analysis where they tried to extrapolate values from other population-based studies or using self-report hearing in here, and you see that we sort of have these much wider margins of error even, and the estimates, 4% in China, 6% in India, 8% in Latin America on hearing and dementia. And part of that is going to be that there's other modifiable risk factors, but I think part of it is also that we don't fully understand this relationship very well. And what I mean by that is we still don't know for sure how we get from hearing loss to cognitive decline. And this is where I think LASI-DAD is incredibly important in that it's really a first in kind global study to add these best practice hearing measures to the complete study like this and give us an idea where we may be able to glean insights now into these mediation analyses as the study goes on. We think we know some pathways. Cognitive load is proposed. This is that same idea that I told you in the beginning. If you're listening to a difficult signal constantly, you get that effortful listening. And you're almost getting this idea like Danny Kahneman proposed. He's a Nobel-winning psychologist, that the brain is operating at 100% if you're taking away effort from somewhere else in the brain to process this poor signal. It's going to come at the expense of something. So they believe it might be a working memory issue, if the prefrontal cortex is lighting up to work on this. But we don't know for sure because we have trouble measuring cognitive load in epidemiologic studies. We think that we do have some evidence that in adults with hearing loss, the prefrontal cortex actually starts to activate when they're listening to sounds versus normal hearing adults who don't have that same prefrontal cortical area activation. And they believe that is that sort of, extra compensatory activity going on. We think that there's direct effects on the brain. There's an emerging literature now showing that adults with hearing loss have lower gray matter volume, recruitment of other executive networks, and just faster rates of overall brain atrophy and poorer white matter, particularly in the temporal lobe, though, which is the auditory area of the brain. But this does make sense. This is the sensory system is interaxial and it affects many areas of the brain, and so just stimulation could matter. Um, and then these are independent in more recent analyses of Alzheimer's pathology, creating sort of a second hit scenario where we looked in the atherosclerosis risk and community study, Jennifer Deal and I, thinking about the association between cognitive dementia, Alzheimer's pathology, and hearing loss. And what we saw is that both Alzheimer's pathology and hearing loss were related to dementia independently, but not related to one another, which actually is it was kind of a relief in some ways to see that in the literature that, something that could have been sort of just, common cause and correlation really does not seem to be there. So it's not maybe perhaps just an aging phenomenon. And the last one that is proposed, but again, not fully known, is social isolation. Social isolation is associated with so many adverse health outcomes, and Danny or John Cacioppo's work, who unfortunately passed away way too young, but had an amazing body of work from Chicago, showing that social isolation, independent of physical activity, is associated with changes in biologic effects on the body. Increased inflammation, poorer upregulation of pro-inflammatory cytokines, it really is a phenomenon that, despite what some of us, might prefer, we are meant to be social creatures in some way. And it has this sort of biologic area, but also related to health behavior pathways, other psychologic pathways, and again, those physiologic ones. Um, but for sure, we don't know whether or not we can do it, or whether or not any of these are true pathways. They're all proposed because we sort of have the A and the B, but we don't have the full picture in a mediation analysis. It comes up very often in our work whether or not you could even measure hearing in persons with dementia at this point. If you've gotten to a point where you have a proposed pathway and you believe that this is real, sometimes we get sort of this idea, well, is there an information bias that you can't measure it? And as I mentioned earlier, based on my clinical experience, you can, and then more recent experience research that's come out by Jonathan Peel's lab, showing that there's strong test-retest reliability for hearing measures with those with mild dementia compared to cognitively normal participants. Even those who are like more extreme levels of dementia didn't seem to have any effect of the ability to do the task. And that really, I think, is that it's a low load task. It's very much this peripheral response to sound. So naturally, what I think comes up when we get to this point is, okay, if hearing loss is related and you have mechanistic pathways, well, could you just add a hearing aid to modify the pathways? And it's a great question. We've looked at it in observational data. This is from the National Health Aging Trends Study. A trainee of mine published it in JAMA 2 or 3 years ago. And we were looking at dementia and hearing loss and hearing aid use. And yes, we found the same story, increased prevalence risk of dementia for those with more hearing loss. And then among those with hearing loss, we looked at hearing aid use and we see a significant decrease in risk. The problem, though, in using observational data is that observational findings truly could be confounded. Hearing aids are people who use hearing aids have much better access to financial, social, or cognitive resources to look after their health compared to those with hearing loss without hearing aids. And when I say that it's like, potentially confounded, and, you might think, well, can't we just adjust for it? They're really far apart. In the United States, the difference between, when we look at longitudinal data and we look at hearing aid uptake, our team has shown that over the past 15 years, hearing aid uptake overall in the US is like 23% higher. But that is largely driven by those living at 200% or above federal poverty income ratio who have like a 43% increase in uptake. But even in this period of, prosperity in some sense and, increased uptake, those living at or below federal poverty level in the United States actually saw a 13% decrease in hearing aid uptake. And that's really alarming because this is the same period where in the United States we actually saw Medicaid, the low income federal insurance program, start to cover hearing aids in states. And so even with increased coverage, the access still and the uptake still remains relatively poor. It's super strongly associated, and I think that no matter how much you try in observational literature, it is really hard to get sort of a perfect study, and so we do need sort of randomized control trials, which our team did publish the first major randomized control trial for hearing aids and cognitive decline in 2024 or 2023, sorry. This was published. In this study, I'll give you a really high level overview. We're not going to go into the study, so we can move on to the LASI findings now. But we had 977 participants, 70 years to 84 years of age, untreated hearing loss, normal cognition at baseline. Some of them came from a long-standing epidemiologic trial, and the majority were from sort of new volunteers for a study. They were randomized to hearing intervention versus a successful aging control. And then we looked at cognitive decline at 3 years as the main outcome. And the truth is, in the main study, there's no effect of hearing care on cognitive decline in the total combined cohort over 3 years. Much to our chagrin, and much to our, we were sort of upset about this. We just didn't see the effect. But if you look at our 3-year change, we're really not seeing much change. So this is using a large cognitive test battery and using factor scores, and we just don't see the control group changing much. But in a pre-specified analysis, we looked at those who came from the long-standing epidemiologic trial, the ERIC study, versus the de novo recruited participants. And we did see an effect in that ERIC group. Hearing aid intervention and the allocation for randomization was blocked so that these are balanced groups. The ERIC group had a 48% reduction in cognitive decline. And at first, we were sort of, not perplexed, let's say, but we were like, that's surprising that it would be so different. But the truth is, when we presented this work at AAIC and as we've thought more about it, it's pretty clear that this ERIC group has many more risk factors for cognitive decline. They have higher rates of diabetes, poorer cardiovascular disease, lower income levels, lower education levels, versus the de novo group, who are several orders of magnitude more healthy than the relative community. And this might make sense if you think about it. The ERIC group represents people who joined a trial in their 40s and 50s versus the de novo who are joining a trial in their 70s. And, I can't remember who it was. One of the NIA program officers stood up, and the first thing they said was, when we presented this work, well, this makes sense. Who joins a dementia or a cognition trial in their 70s? People who probably will never get dementia, right? They have a lot of resources to be able to do that at that age and have families surrounding them and transportation and income and leisure time versus those who, at the same age have poorer risk factors who have already aged into sort of a worse outcome. Whereas those who join a trial maybe in their 40s, it's easier to hold on to them longer and study that group who has higher risk factors. And we've also corroborated this finding by doing an analysis where instead of looking by recruitment source, we created risk factor profiles for cognitive decline, and we found that those in the highest quartile for risk of cognitive decline also experienced the largest benefit of hearing care in our study. And I'm not sure that it's necessarily, just to make sure I say this cleanly, I don't believe that this means that you have to be super high risk to benefit from hearing care. I believe it's more of a function of it's very hard to measure cognitive decline in people who don't decline. And so what we're seeing is that when you limit it to groups that do experience decline, we can pick up on those differences, right? Because it is subtle and it is something that sort of is insidious and slow. So, ongoing work to be seen there. But moving to, as a background, moving from a large high level background to our stuff now in LASI-DAD, which is super exciting. Like I said, this is the first time in many ways that we've seen a national study implement hearing measures outside of the United States and Western Europe. It's been pretty rare to see. And I actually think that working on LASI-DAD has lit up the phone lines for us on our team because so many studies around the world now have wanted to add different measures of hearing. And the impetus for this is really, I think, getting at the audiometric measures. You can, like I said before, you can measure hearing via self-report, or you could do speech and noise tests. But again, cognition is basic to those tests. It's something that, is required to complete the test or could affect the way you respond. Whereas these auditory measures, these pure tone measures, are very automatic. They don't require a lot of cognitive load, and they're purely peripheral. There's no central pathway back to the cognitive measures or to the auditory measures. And I think that's important in that there is some research out there published that suggests that, well, maybe dementia causes hearing loss. What is very key in those studies is that they used a speech measure for hearing loss. And speech is a function of cognition, right? To understand language, to make sense of speech and repeat it back, it's cognitive. So, of course, dementia would cause a potential decline in speech understanding ability, but it doesn't necessarily, there's no biologic or physiologic or model that would show us that it would affect encoding of these peripheral signals. That's a pretty much one-way pathway. And so the criterion standard is audiometric measures. In recent years, they've added them to tablets. There are a couple of companies, there's actually several companies now that have really done this. But when we started, there were only two. We use the four frequency pure tone average. This is a average of 500, 1000, 2000 hertz. These are the most important areas for speech understanding. So it gives us a good representation of how in your everyday life, you're sort of out there communicating with people and able to access sound. We use the World Health Organization criteria, which again has changed. It became less conservative several years ago. So now more people have hearing loss because of the change. Um, and our team sort of developed our own quality control and ambient noise monitoring system for this. Uh, the nice thing, the cool thing here is that we actually developed our own algorithm to assess potential abnormalities, implausible patterns during the testing. And then all implausible tests were flagged and then sent to two audiologists for remote processing and reading to check on them. And for that, we sort of, uh, I'll skip one slide and then I'll go back in a sec to show you. We sort of look at the patterns, and what you see up top, those are relatively normal patterns of hearing loss. As we age, our hearing tends to get worse in the higher frequencies. So 4000 hertz, 8000 hertz, those are higher pitch signals. But when you see a pattern where you have something really bad at one frequency, and then it gets better, and then it gets worse and better, these sort of zigzag patterns like this, that's physiologically implausible. Your ear is encoded, and the cellular structure is like a piano. So if one key is missing, it's very unlikely that the next one would be like really good, right? It's kind of going to have gradients and be sort of these slopes. So these are very unlikely, and it suggests that something's going on. And so what we did was created this 5-point algorithm that looked at differences between the frequencies, differences between the ears, noise during testing, long duration or short duration of testing, or differences in the averages that were excessive, and we flagged the data. The truth is that we changed sort of our cut points, and we used a machine learning model to actually change our flags over time to become more precise. So overall, we flagged 25% of the data, but by the end, we were flagging like 10%. We rejected less than 1% of the tests. Of the total eligible for testing, we were able to complete, of the total eligible 4,557, we were able to complete 4,409, which is pretty darn good. To give you an idea, we usually have high missingness in our studies for the hearing measures. It's just, it's an extra test that takes a while. It has technology, it has its own tablet, it happens in studies. So LASI, even though, you've got a study out in the field, conducting thousands of tests, this is pretty darn good. This might be one of the better missingness numbers we ever had, and I think that speaks a lot to the training and the team in the field in India and how strong they are. Um, I put this slide in, so when you get the slide deck, you're welcome to it. You can scan this QR code, and it will actually give you a video. I can't show you the video because it'll take up our whole time, because we sort of slowly walk through the whole test. But if you're interested, it's like a 15-minute video of us doing the test and showing the slow walkthrough of exactly how it occurs, how people hear the assessment and sort of raise their hand. I also always point out this pilot data that we were starting with this being like an on average 9 minute or so test, and we got it down to, the 4 to 5 minute range by the end of our piloting. And I think that's, again, it's a testament to the study and the structure and the design, but it shows to me that you can do this in studies with a relatively rapid period, whereas before hearing testing, we used to estimate it would take 30 minutes. And these automated algorithms have really changed the system for us. So this is a huge innovation in the field. So on to looking at who had hearing data and didn't have hearing data. When this is before we were able to collect a lot of retrospective data, or I shouldn't say retrospective data that got kind of lost in the cloud. And so this number is actually different now, but I'm presenting this table because it's cleaner and we've got the weights applied to it. The truth is, it doesn't change who is missing. The numbers just change. So what we see is that maybe as expected, uh, age, gender, urban versus rural, education levels, and reading, writing, literacy are all associated with, or sorry, not urban versus rural, but the other ones are associated with more missingness of the having the hearing value. And this is not uncommon. It's usually this same group, these sociodemographic characteristics that we see in the NHATS study, for example, or ERIC. They're the group just most likely to have missing data in general, random missing tests throughout their test batteries in these studies. Um, we looked at religion and caste. We also looked at region of the country. We looked at or different technicians. We saw no other trends. And I left the urban versus rural one in here because I think in India, we actually see a reverse trend that I'll show you of hearing loss being associated with urban versus rural areas. And so just an idea that we do have some missing data. It's smaller than this now, but it is associated with some high risk characteristics, and it's led us to make sure we apply inverse probability weighting in our analyses. And so, with that, we created some inverse probability weights, and we wanted to do a statistical analysis just to look at the descriptives by age, gender, urbanicity. We did some chi-square tests and some Kruskal-Wallis to look at the differences in the variables. And then we did take the 2011 Indian census to actually calculate corresponding population sizes. And so this is some recent work. As probably expected, if you're looking by typical in the gray, mild in the light blue, moderate in the blue, dark blue, and the orange triangles being severe, as we age, moderate and severe hearing loss are increasing in prevalence, whereas, the mild and the normal are sort of decreasing. Again, mild makes up the majority, but it really does tip off that once we get over the age of like 75 to 80, the plurality of hearing loss is moderate or severe, which is a big deal because that is where you really do struggle, even in normal situations, right? Mild hearing loss you can usually get over as long as you have a relatively quiet background, you're in just a regular room, no big deal. But moderate is where you get into that stage where we really truly do recommend a hearing aid. These numbers very much, or these patterns reflect other countries that we've seen data in. If we're looking for the prevalence data in just some more percentages, overall, 88% of adults over 60 in LASI-DAD have hearing loss. And again, that number sounds large. It is larger than what you've heard before because the new World Health Organization standards just changed the criteria for hearing loss. If we use the old standards, it's closer to like 55 to 60%, which is basically the exact a very similar number to what we've seen in the United States in the past. Slightly under in the US relative, but it's hard to compare. Prevalence increases with age, as you'd probably expect. When we created census estimates, can you talk reasons in detail about missingness in the hearing data? Uh, oh, so let me make sure I say this really cleanly. I'm going to take this question now because I don't want to have to go back on it. This missing is actually much lower. It is closer to, um, I think, only like 200 or 300 missing. We ran these numbers before we were able to capture data out of the cloud, but the patterns associated with missingness are still the same, which is why I showed it to the group here. So it's not necessarily high. There are people who refused, but there's also just people who, my impression is, we have like a list of reasons and it's sometimes just did not test. And my impression is from doing this in, several different epidemiologic trials now, in general, those who don't have the measure are just people who are going to have missing measures across a lot of things because, they are sort of the higher risk and more difficult to test in general group, and they just can't do as much. And so it's not necessarily abnormal, but I do think the pattern is such that we always need to remember who doesn't have tests so that we are making sure we think about selection bias to those who have testing and who don't. Um, when we look at actually using the census data, 91 million Indians over the age of 60 have hearing loss, which is I might be looking at like other countries and census data. Other than China, I think this is the largest absolute population over 60 with hearing loss in the world. And that's even taking into account that Europe and the United States have a much broader age pyramid in the sense that, they are just they're older societies in general. And so that pyramid is a little bit more of a square in Europe, might even be an upside down triangle at this point, but in the United States, it's much more rectangular. And so I did do a quick peek at census estimates, though, because India as a country is rapidly aging in the sense that, they are experiencing the same change in the pyramid shape, the population pyramid. This number would triple by 2050. So we're looking at in the next 30 years, 270 million to 300 million with hearing loss, which is a large, large number. And so I think in some ways it sort of underlines just when we think about this as a risk factor for poor aging outcomes, this is something that's going to be compounded fast, and it represents an area too, from a policy perspective, a large population who potentially there's a low risk intervention for hearing to prevent other poor outcomes in life. Looking at urban versus rural, we see higher prevalence of hearing loss in urban areas versus rural areas in India. I show this because to me, I have made not a whole career, but I have several papers and several studies and grants showing that in the United States, hearing loss is actually associated with living in rural areas. It's in part due to poorer health in those areas, but also because a lot of the sound exposure, the recreational activities that people do in the United States, gunfire, using like what do you call them, four-wheelers and go-karts and things like that, a lot of them are done in more rural areas, even though the base level noise is louder in urban areas. But this actually flips the picture, and I think it's an interesting insight into perhaps phenotypes that we could think about of what hearing loss looks like and causes of hearing loss around the world, because it is truly different from what we've seen in the past. So moving on to the cognitive measures, we wanted to look, and again, we are using, now we're thinking about who had data available. So the numbers, again, flip a little bit because these are people who have both cognitive and hearing tests available to us. Um, Audiometric measures, we're using the same four frequency pure tone average that you've seen in the other studies. And we're looking at the Harmonized Cognitive Assessment Protocol, localized to India with the factor scores, the global and domain scores. We used inverse probability weighting. We used the weights provided, and we used linear and logistic regression models to assess this. Again, just looking at that table one of our characteristics in this sample, older adults with people with hearing loss are more likely to be older. They're more likely to live alone. They're more likely to have higher risk of diabetes and hypertension, and they're more likely to be urban versus rural. And again, I highlight this because this is fascinating to me because a lot of work in the US living in rural areas is also a risk factor for other poorer health outcomes like dementia. And so I really do think this is something that as we're thinking about our next steps, we want to do some more modification analyses and perhaps looking at more specifically these two groups as both risk factors for hearing loss and the risk factors of or how it might modify the association between hearing and cognition. When we look at the cognitive domain scores by hearing status, as you might expect, things get worse with increased hearing loss. It's much easier than to look at the numbers because these are those factor scores and z-scores that in some ways are like, oh, well, they're not that big. That's hard to make sense of. It's usually easier to go ahead and look at the figures. And I apologize, I couldn't get my Stata to produce a nicer figure when I was screenshotting these. So it's a little bit fuzzy on the actual writing. But just looking at a model adjusted for age, sex, religion, caste, urban versus rural, education, literacy, obesity, smoking status, hypertension, diabetes, stroke, and heart disease, we see that those with mild loss, or sorry, those with moderate and severe loss have significantly poorer global cognition scores than those with normal. Mild loss also not associated. We did some bootstrapping on this and looked at just trends for P, and we do see that it's a significant trend even when doing multiple adjustments. Same thing with memory. And I mean, they really do mirror each other pretty closely. We don't see, a huge difference even when we look at language, orientation. Language, you'll also see had the mild group become significant, and that's probably because I think the language ones, there's a lot more auditory task involved. There's a lot more auditory processing in some sense, and so like access to the test may matter. And we all, we see the same trend though, same story with executive function. Uh, Visuospatial, we didn't expect necessarily to be related to cognitive decline, but I think in just looking at the collinearity between all the tests, this might make some sense too. Um, what's fascinating then for us is that we started to make splines, something that hasn't been done in this literature very well. And some of it is because we don't have the right numbers to do it. And so I think we originally envisioned this all as one paper for the cognitive test, and I think now we're thinking, as we've been writing the paper, that perhaps this may be something we look at separately. We see different trends by different age groups, and some of this could be survivor, right? As you get older, right? This is a group that's survived to a certain age, and they're just doing better in general, and so things change. But the real strong slope of association, if you will, this magnitude of the slope between pure tone average and global cognition scores, it really seems to occur when we look at groups in that mid range. Whereas those who have really survived to like having more hearing loss, or they've got to that point because it is a function of age, they really just don't see the same slope. And so we don't see when we look by these ranges in hearing status, those who are normal versus those who have a lot of hearing loss really not these strong associations, but whereas in that middle range we see a huge sloping effect. And I think this is fascinating to kind of dig in on more and think through with our team. I think we just haven't had the numbers in older populations like this before to start to think this way. And when we because these hearing measures again, they're sort of so collinear with age, I do think that this is also sort of a function of what you're basically looking at is you could replace better ear PTA on the bottom here with age, and you'd see the exact same trends. And so maybe that's all it is, but it's also fascinating for us to think about maybe we can use this data to start to think about the optimal intervention period for degree of hearing loss for when we really need to do something because they're starting to drop off more. And the truth is, using that 20 to 60 is a pretty wide range, and we could become more specific on our splines or use some area under the curve measures to let the data tell us what might be the right cut point. So I think it's just a different way of thinking of it, but I wanted to share it because for us, it's how this data gives us a new sort of ability to have these insights, just because we haven't seen this before. Um, Whoops. With that, I'll stop and we can do questions in the last 10 minutes. You know, audiometrically measured hearing loss is associated with lower cognitive scores in an older Indian population. This corroborates data from the US, Europe, and China, but we really do seem to have a different population than the United States in particular, and then Europe as well. When it comes to the group that has hearing loss and doesn't have hearing loss, that urban versus rural thing, I harp on it and I'm fixated on it because it's so different. We've never seen a reverse trend that strong before, and there's no reason for me to believe that there's any sort of anomalies going on here. We keep looking at urban versus rural by missingness, by the patterns of hearing loss. We just don't see anything that suggests that this is, spurious. It looks, the data looks good, and it may just be that it could be the recreational activities that occur in the countries and like what happens in rural versus urban areas. It could be, differences in healthcare status and access to care by country that we haven't had access to before, something that is, very cutting edge for us. But it does sort of, for me, raise the flag of let's look deeper into these areas. And perhaps some of the things we've thought about on this relationship too between hearing and cognition. For example, previously we have never really controlled for noise exposure and what that might cause in this. And noise exposure itself is related to cardiovascular measures that could mediate, an association to dementia. And it's very possible, and you won't hear many researchers do this, but I don't have the same ego maybe. It's very possible the past 15 years of my life have been wrong because we haven't measured noise before, and we've been creating a backdoor pathway for these associations. And so I think that when I see something that's very collinear with not just health access and health status, but noise in urban versus rural, and we think that's the driver, it really raises to me the issue that, LASI-DAD might be in a good position to lead that work with people like Sarah from Michigan, thinking about these strong environmental epidemiologists. But anyway, that remains to be seen. It's work that'll take time on our end and everybody else's end, but we are limited by the cross-sectional nature of the data, of course, but I think these are strong measures so far, and they're corroborating the literature. And I think, we are hitting that Hills criteria of causality at some point where we've just got the repeated findings. I am happy if anyone ever wants to use the hearing data. You don't have to go through me, but at all. That's not my job, not my role. I'm not a gatekeeper, but I'm always happy to talk with people and just offer advice on how to use the measures or any code that we can provide. We don't need to be a part of your papers. If you want us to, we're happy to, but we also just are here to help. So if anyone becomes interested in this, please, if we can be helpful, reach out. I would love to see the data get used. So with that, I will stop, and I think we have 10 minutes left. I hope this is helpful. I hope it's informative. I hope it makes sense. I'm happy to chat.
Thank you so much, Nick. It's very interesting. I think you have some questions here.
Awesome. Uh, how to measure BPTA? Yeah. So the BPTA, when you get the if you were to look at this data, BPTA is better ear pure tone average. We've calculated it but for you in the data with like the high level, where what we're doing is essentially saying here is the average of the frequencies most important for speech: 500, 1000, 2000, and 4000 hertz. We calculate it for each ear. Uh, there is It is very rare for people to have differences in their ears. Basically, the difference is negligible unless they had, truly some sort of medical condition causing, sudden hearing loss on one side. And usually those differences will be extreme. So most people have the same, but we still take the better ear, just sort of under the assumption that that's the function that everyone is living in their everyday life. So it's quite literally just an average of those frequencies and then taking the better of the two ears. We've calculated it for you, and then you can apply those BPTA figures. You can use them as a continuous variable, which runs about a zero, which would be like minimal hearing, like no hearing loss whatsoever, perfect hearing, 20 being the cutoff for hearing loss, and then up to about 100. 90 to 100 could be the highest it could get with very severe, profound hearing loss. It's both continuous and categorical. I will say, as as an epidemiologist, I sort of always say use the continuous. I care more about that than anything else. You're sacrificing power when you use the categorical. But the categories are helpful for public health interpretation. And so, you know, if you're ever thinking about policy in your work, it is useful to have a clinical cut point because it adds those ability. Earlier when I was showing those slides on 90 million, Indians have hearing loss, it's nice to have those cut points to give you that data. So my personal recommendation is use BPTA continuously in your inferential statistics, but always give us some sort of, take home that's very much, the categories of hearing loss or mild hearing loss is associated with 5 times the risk of cognitive decline or something like that. It's a much more meaningful way to, I think, communicate your findings. Thanks for that comment. Well, and I'll send out these slides as a PDF. Sarah was definitely reminding me because I'm the kind of person who practices my talks like the morning before. So I uh, I apologize that they're not already posted, but they'll be posted immediately following.
So while we are waiting for next question, Nick, I should tell you that we are getting piloting the noise,
Yeah.
indoor noise, so we can capture some of the soundscapes in the people's homes. So maybe in next year or next cycle of wave 3, we should be able to look at the noise data together with the audiometry data. That would be awesome.
I think it's super exciting. I think that could really push forward sort of a newer area in this space. I just think, unfortunately, we have not thought a lot about noise, and hearing is the biomarker for noise exposure. We don't collect all the frequencies necessary to see it, but if you were to collect like a clinical measure, which would add like several other frequencies in the highs, you actually see a phenotype pattern for noise where there's a notch in the audiogram. And scary enough, in young adults, I'll tell everyone, we've seen some nationally representative data in Europe, the United States, and now China, showing that many young adults, they may not have hearing loss, but they have the phenotypic biomarker for noise exposure already showing, just suggesting that probably all of us listening to iPods and our phones and all the time with earbuds on is causing this sort of noise damage. And so we've come a long way in reducing noise exposure in factories, for example, but we may be on the precipice of an environmental epidemiologic disaster, and for me, a disaster with hearing loss.
Yeah, fascinating area of research. Thank you.
Yeah, yeah. How do you see? I'll answer the second one first. Yes, these findings mostly align with other studies, but the big difference would be the groups that have hearing loss. Like, think when we're getting into like almost like the risk factors for hearing loss or what it's associated with, those are where we see it different, but the overall findings between hearing loss and cognition and the prevalence in general, the same. And so I get excited when I do see those kinds of differences though in the groups because it tells me we might get closer to, mechanistic analyses. And that gets at the point of this first part. When we think about the brain and the changes in the brain related to hearing loss, I think what we mostly are hypothesizing and seeing, and we've looked in dementia-free adults over time in the Baltimore Longitudinal Study of Aging, for example, as well as now in the atherosclerosis risk and community study. We see these specific, mostly not fully limited, but larger changes in the temporal lobe. The temporal lobe is where auditory processing starts to really occur, and I mean it is the area that would get the most stimulation, which makes sense. We don't have uh, pathways that go back to the ear from these sort of once it gets to the brain for central processing. We don't really have anything that goes back to the ear that really tells us anything or does much. There is a protein that gets a little bit of a signal that hey something's happening, but it happens in the brainstem where it gets that afferent efferent sort of loop. But once we get to this brain level, we don't see it. So I think our team believes that, it is the stimulation that matters. I'll say that from the Achieve study, we've actually seen that just stimulating with hearing aids does seem to change atrophy levels in the decline. It also, though, we're seeing that people without their hearing aids on even are doing better in like speech and noise settings, for example, when we do those testing paradigms. And we think that is, we're stimulating the brain, we are reactivating areas that are starting to shut down because they're not getting any stimulation. And then that helps us in processing in noisy situations, even without the hearing aids on, which is a really telling thing because if you think about it, if I take my glasses off, I'm suddenly usually, like, oh, I can't see as much. I get used to the glasses, right? So even without aids, people do a little bit better. So I think the physiologic area is super fascinating. Um, the best way to collaborate. Oh, please just reach out to us. I do a lot of work in South Africa. Duet Swanepoel at the University of Pretoria and I do a lot together. And I am more than happy to offer some insights. We share our protocols pretty freely with everyone. We don't have any issue with that. And Duet is amazing and a champion of Africa. And I'm happy to make those connections and facilitate whatever I can. Um, I mean, 90. I think one of the questions might be incomplete. But then yes, aligns with other studies, and then yes, it's a sensory deprivation concept in some sense for stimulation, if you will.
All right, Nick, it was a terrific presentation as usual. Thanks so much for finding time today and talk to our audience here. And hopefully we can get connected in person very soon. Maybe in
And
New York, maybe
yeah,
somewhere else.
we're gonna be crossing. Yeah. All right.
Yeah, yeah,
Very good to
very
see
good.
you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so
Yeah,
much for
thanks
having me.
everybody for joining us today. Yes, bye.
Bye, everyone.